Festive music played on Japanese radio. The announcer solemnly declared to the world, "The aircraft carrier Enterprise has been sunk. The United States Pacific Fleet is decapitated." In Tokyo, champagne bottles were uncorked. Admirals shook hands, certain that the Empire's greatest nightmare had finally vanished into the depths. But they were wrong. At that very moment, thousands of miles away from the celebrating Japanese, a massive gray shadow was emerging from the fog. Battle-scarred, smoking, but very much alive. This is not just a story about a piece of iron. This is the story of a ship that refused to go away, even when the laws of physics demanded it. They tried to stop her 3 times. Kamikazes crashed into her, bombs tore her decks to pieces, and even her own allies wrote her off before the greatest battles had even begun. The Japanese nicknamed her the Gray Ghost because every time they announced her demise, she rose from the ashes to strike back. How did one ship manage to replace an entire fleet when America stood completely alone? What dark secret did the mechanics hide as they patched holes in the heat of battle? And why, after all her heroics, did her homeland commit a betrayal against her that remains shameful to recall? Today, we open archives that have been silent for decades. You will see footage that makes the blood run cold. Prepare yourselves. This is the Enterprise, and her watch is just beginning. To understand the nature of this ship, we must travel back to the mid-1930s, to the Newport News shipyard. The air vibrates with the roar of riveting hammers. U.S. Navy engineers faced a staggering challenge. The Washington Naval Treaty tied their hands. Fleet tonnage was strictly limited. Every extra kilogram of armor meant sacrificing either planes or speed. And the designers made a bet that would define the fate of the entire Pacific War. They abandoned heavy armor. Unlike British carriers with their armored flight decks, the new Yorktown class, to which Enterprise belonged, was covered only with a layer of teak wood. This decision seemed like madness. Any bomb could punch right through her. But in return, Enterprise gained speed. 33 knots. Over 60 kilometers per hour for a 25,000-ton behemoth. It was this speed that would become her primary shield. She could outrun torpedoes, move into launch positions rapidly, and vanish into the mist before the enemy knew where the blow came from. December 1941. Enterprise is returning to base after a secret mission to deliver fighters to Wake Island. A relaxed atmosphere reigns on board. Christmas is coming. Sailors are polishing their dress uniforms, dreaming of shore leave in Honolulu. According to the schedule, the carrier was supposed to enter Pearl Harbor at exactly 7:30 a.m. on December 7th. The crew could already see the piers and familiar bars in their minds. But the ocean had other plans. On the evening of December 6th, a monstrous storm slammed into the task force. Waves washed over the flight deck, tearing away lifeboats and bending the railings of the escorting destroyers. Admiral William Halsey, nicknamed Bull for his fierce temper, was furious. The elements were delaying his fleet. Because of the storm, refueling the destroyers dragged on, and the schedule shifted. Enterprise was running late. None of the thousands of men on board knew then that this storm was a gift from fate. Morning, December 7th. The sky cleared. Enterprise is 200 miles from Oahu. To save time, Halsey orders a group of scouts to launch and head toward Ford Island Airfield. The pilots disappear into the clear morning sky. At 8 a.m., the radio operators on the ship catch strange signals. One pilot's voice breaks into a scream. "Don't shoot! I'm an American!" Through the static, Japanese speech breaks through. And then comes the phrase that forever divided history into before and after. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. Silence fell over the bridge of the Enterprise. Men looked at each other, refusing to believe it. It couldn't be. But the horizon confirmed the terrible truth. In the distance, a thick black pillar of smoke was rising. That was the battleship Arizona burning. That was the entire Pacific Fleet burning. If not for that storm, Enterprise would be sitting there now, in Battleship Row, moored and helpless, a perfect target for Japanese torpedo planes. Nature had preserved her so she could exact her revenge. Admiral Halsey stared through his binoculars at the smoke on the horizon. His face, usually red from the wind, turned white with rage. He understood. The old world was gone. The rules had changed. Battleships, the pride of the nation, were now just heaps of burning metal. The only force standing between the U.S. and total defeat was his aircraft carrier. He turned to his officers and gave the order that became the motto for the next 4 years. Sink everything you see under the Japanese flag. The war had begun. And the first chance to prove that Enterprise survived for a reason came 6 months later, at a tiny atoll called Midway. June 1942, intelligence reported a Japanese armada was moving toward Midway Atoll. 4 heavy carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the very ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Against them, the U.S. had only 3 carriers, and one of them, the Yorktown, was holding on by a thread after previous battles. The odds weren't just uneven. It looked like a hopeless endeavor. The morning of June 4th began with nervous anticipation. The ocean is vast, and finding an enemy in it is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Only this needle is armed to the teeth and wants to destroy you. From the deck of the Enterprise, an air group under the command of Wade McCluskey launched into the sky. 33 dauntless dive bombers. Their task was simple: find and neutralize. Hours ticked by. The pilots flew over the endless blue expanse. Fuel was disappearing. The gauge needles crept relentlessly toward zero. McCluskey realized the point of no return was approaching. If they didn't find the Japanese in the next few minutes, they would have to turn back, dumping their bombs into the sea or ditch in the water, which meant a fatal outcome. And then a miracle happened. McCluskey spotted the lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi, below, racing to catch up with its main forces. It left a clear, white, foamy trail behind it, like a pointer arrow. McCluskey made a decision that historians would later call one of the 20th century. He ordered his planes to follow the destroyer. Minutes later, a sight opened before the pilots that took their breath away. The entire Japanese fleet was in the palm of their hand. And most incredibly, they caught the enemy at their most vulnerable moment. The Japanese decks were crowded with planes that had just returned from an attack and were refueling. Fuel hoses, bombs, torpedoes, all of it lay right on the decks. It was a powder keg, waiting for a single spark. The Enterprise pilots pushed their machines into a dive, a 70-degree angle. Speed builds. Wind howls in the flaps. The aircraft frame vibrates with tension. In the sights, a massive red circle on the deck of the Japanese flagship Kaga. Altitude drops. 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. Japanese anti-aircraft guns open a wall of fire, but it's too late. 10:22 a.m. The first bomb detaches from the fuselage. Seconds later, the world turned upside down. 4 hits on the Kaga. Monstrous explosions tear the ship apart from the inside. Simultaneously, another group from the Yorktown attacks the Soryu, and a squadron from the Enterprise under Dick Best drops a bomb exactly in the center of the flagship Akagi's deck. The bomb punches through the deck and explodes in a hangar full of armed aircraft. Only 5 minutes, from 10:25 to 10:30. In those 5 minutes, the Empire lost 3 of its best aircraft carriers. 3 giants turned into blazing torches. The battle that was supposed to be Japan's triumph became a catastrophe. Enterprise and her pilots broke the back of the Japanese Navy. When the planes returned to their home deck, many pilots wept. From tension, from the loss of comrades, but mostly from the realization of what they had just accomplished. It seemed the war was won. It seemed the worst was over. But the euphoria was premature. Japan was wounded, but not broken. Ahead lay the Solomon Islands, a place where naval battles would turn into a bloody meat grinder of attrition. The euphoria of victory evaporated quickly. The war moved south to the stifling tropics, to an archipelago whose name would soon become synonymous with hell: Guadalcanal. There was no room for elegant maneuvers here. This was a brawl in a telephone booth. The Japanese threw everything they had into regaining the initiative, and on August 24, 1942, they found the Enterprise. That day, radars picked up a large group of enemy aircraft. Sirens wailed, but there was almost no time to prepare. Japanese Val dive bombers plummeted from the heavens like a flock of birds of prey. Enterprise's anti-aircraft guns glowed white-hot, spewing tons of lead into the sky, but it was impossible to stop them all. The first bomb hit the aft elevator. The explosion ripped through the deck, going deep into the ship. Seconds later, a second strike. A direct hit on a 5-inch gun battery. The gun crew ceased to exist instantly. Burning metal and shrapnel sprayed across the deck. A third bomb exploded near the superstructure. The ship shuddered like a living creature taking a gut punch. It seemed she was about to stop. But it was at this moment that the primary difference between the two fleets became clear. When a Japanese carrier took such damage, she was often doomed. Japanese doctrine prioritized attack above all, neglecting protection. Their fire suppression systems were primitive, and crews were poorly trained in firefighting. On the Enterprise, everything was different. As soon as the smoke cleared, damage control parties went to work. These men were the heroes of the invisible front. While the flight deck blazed, men below were shutting off fuel lines, risking suffocation from carbon monoxide. They patched holes with wooden beams and mattresses, standing waist-deep in water mixed with fuel oil. They restored electrical power, connecting severed cables with their bare hands. An hour after the attack, while the Japanese were already reporting to their command that the carrier was burning and losing headway, Enterprise turned into the wind and began recovering her planes. She was covered in black scorch marks. The deck was buckled. 74 crew members did not return from their battle stations. By engines were running. The rudders responded. The Big E withstood a blow that would have sent any other ship to the bottom. She returned to Pearl Harbor to lick her wounds. Shipyard workers, seeing her condition, said repairs would take months. The crew replied, "You have 2 weeks." The U.S. fleet was vanishing. The carrier Saratoga took a torpedo and went for repairs. The Wasp was lost. Only 2 combat-ready carriers remained in service, the hastily repaired Enterprise and her sister ship, Hornet. 2 ships against the entire might of the Japanese Empire. In October, they put to sea together. The Admirals knew the next battle would be decisive. But no one could have predicted that one of these sisters would not return home, and the other would go through a hell so fierce that the living would envy the dead. October 26, 1942, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The day luck seemed to finally abandon the American fleet. Radars again showed a massive incoming air armada, but this time the Japanese acted with coordination and cruelty. Their first target was the Hornet. The crew of the Big E watched with horror as a tragedy unfolded miles away. Japanese pilots fell upon the Hornet with animal ferocity. Bombs, torpedoes, even damaged planes that pilots intentionally steered into the superstructures. Everything flew at one ship. In 15 minutes, the Hornet turned into a blazing ruin. She drifted on the water, shrouded in black smoke. Now, Enterprise was alone. Absolutely alone in the entire Pacific Ocean. Every Japanese aircraft that still had ammunition turned toward her. Captain Osborne Hardison began to maneuver, squeezing everything possible out of the engines. The massive ship dodged torpedoes, pulling turns so sharp the deck tilted at dangerous angles. 9 torpedoes missed. 9 fatal threats screamed past the hull within meters. But bombs fell from above. One punched through the flight deck at the bow, went through the ship, and exploded over the water. A second hit right behind the forward elevator, exploding inside the ship. Fire, smoke, the screams of the injured. The steering systems failed again. And then, a moment that entered history. Chaos reigned on deck. Gun crews were swept away by explosions. A Japanese pilot, seeing the anti-aircraft fire from one side had stopped, decided the job was done. The ship looked lifeless. He leveled his plane for a low-altitude run to finish off the giant. He could already see the faces of the men on the bridge, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. From the clouds of black smoke, from the twisted nest of a 20mm gun, a tracer fire suddenly erupted. There, among the wreckage, a wounded sailor, who had strapped himself to the gun so he wouldn't fall, squeezed the trigger. It was the ultimate gesture of defiance. The plane burst into flames and crashed into the water meters from the hull. Enterprise bit back, even when she should have been silent. By evening, the battle subsided. The Japanese retreated, certain they had destroyed both American carriers. The Hornet was indeed lost. She had to be abandoned. But Enterprise, smoking, battered, with jammed elevators, kept going. When night fell, Admiral Kinkaid requested the status of the fleet. The answer was short and terrifying. Enterprise is the only functioning carrier in the Pacific. Think about that. Between Japan and the west coast of the U.S., there was nothing left but this scarred ship. The sailors went out on deck. They looked at the empty horizon where their sister Hornet had been that morning. Fear was gone. Only a cold, angry resolve remained. At that moment, a sign appeared on the hangar bulkhead that became legend. Enterprise versus Japan. Imagine this scene. The Pacific Ocean, an endless water desert. And in the center of this void, a lone ship. Her sides covered in soot, temporary patches visible on the hull, and one of the main elevators jammed in the up position. This was all the United States of America had left. Enterprise versus Japan. It wasn't bravado. It was a cold statement of fact. One old, battered ship against the entire might of the Imperial Navy. The situation was critical. The Japanese were preparing a final, crushing blow against Guadalcanal. They sent battleships to wipe the American beachhead off the map. Admiral Halsey, realizing the Marines on the island wouldn't last without air support, gave an order that bordered on madness. Enterprise must put to sea immediately. But there was a problem. The ship was still under repair after the fight at Santa Cruz. The repair ship, USS Vestal, was alongside her. Dozens of engineers, welders, and mechanics worked around the clock, trying to revive the jammed forward hoist. When the order to weigh anchor sounded, the captain of the Vestal frantically contacted the carrier's bridge. "I have men over there! We haven't finished!" The response from Enterprise entered history. "Then they're coming with us." And they went. While the carrier raced at full speed toward Guadalcanal, cutting the waves at 25 knots, work boiled inside her. Civilian specialists and military engineers worked side by side. Welding sparks fell directly onto the ammunition that sailors were preparing for battle. Men slept on the deck in fuel oil, woke up, and picked up their torches again. November 13th, Friday the 13th. Enterprise scouts located the Japanese battleship Hiei. She was a monster that had been shelling American positions with impunity. The battleship seemed an invincible floating castle, but Enterprise pilots thought otherwise. They launched from a deck that just yesterday was considered unusable. Avenger torpedo bombers closed on the target. The Hiei opened fire with all guns, the water around her boiling with explosions. But the Americans didn't turn away. Torpedoes slammed into the battleship's side. The giant slowed. Then the dive bombers fell upon her. By evening, the pride of the Japanese fleet had turned into a lifeless hulk. For the first time in history, an American carrier had participated in the neutralizing of an enemy battleship. But the most amazing thing happened after the attack. Enterprise was so damaged she couldn't recover all her planes. The pilots landed on the battered airfield on Guadalcanal instead. The ship's air group became land-based aviation. They lived in dirty tents with the Marines, refueled planes by hand from barrels. But every morning they rose into the sky again to protect their ship and their island. In those days, Enterprise became a symbol of hope. As long as she was afloat, the war was not lost. The Japanese searched for her in a rage. Tokyo Rose announced her end again on the radio, trying to break the American spirit. But every time the Japanese admirals thought the ocean was clear, the familiar silhouette appeared on the horizon. By 1943, the situation began to change. U.S. shipyards finished the new Essex-class carriers. When the first of them entered Pearl Harbor, Enterprise sailors looked at their relief with the pride of veterans. Enterprise received a well-deserved leave. She went for a major overhaul in the U.S. When she entered Puget Sound, the shipyard workers couldn't contain their emotions. The ship looked as if she had passed through a storm made of steel. But she came in under her own power. She had stood alone against an empire, and now that she had returned, she wasn't just ready to defend, she was ready to become the hunter. 1944 arrived, and the Pacific Ocean changed beyond recognition. If before Enterprise was a lone wolf, now she was the leader of the pack. She didn't return from repairs alone. Beside her were dozens of brand new carriers. The armada stretched to the horizon, and at the head of this force, like a gray-haired veteran among young athletes, walked the Big E. On her bridge stood officers who remembered the bitterness of the first defeats, and now they hungered for payback. In June 1944, this steel avalanche approached the Mariana Islands. The Japanese command decided to give a general battle, throwing in every pilot they could find. On June 19th, Enterprise radars picked up over 400 Japanese aircraft. New Hellcat fighters rose into the sky. What happened next, historians would call not a battle, but a slaughter. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese planes fell into the ocean by the dozens. The sky was streaked with smoky trails. Enterprise pilots said it was like a shooting gallery. By sunset, the Japanese carrier aviation had ceased to exist as an organized force. But the real test for the Enterprise began the next day. And the enemy was not the Japanese, but the darkness. The American fleet pursued the retreating enemy. A strike group launched at sunset, found the enemy, and neutralized the carrier Hyo. But when they turned back, the sun had already set. 200 American planes were returning home in total darkness. Fuel was running out, and below was the black abyss of the ocean, and a fleet maintaining strict light blackout. Pilots began to panic. They circled in the dark, knowing their engines would die in minutes. On the flagship's bridge, Admiral Mitcher faced a terrible choice: maintain the fleet's safety and let hundreds of his best pilots vanish in the water, or break the cardinal law of naval warfare, turn on the lights, and turn his ships into perfect targets for Japanese submarines. Mitcher looked at the dark sky and gave the order: turn on the lights. And here, Enterprise showed why she is a legend. She was the first to snap on her searchlights. Massive beams stabbed vertically into the sky, piercing the gloom. It was a beacon of hope. Following her, lights flickered on across the other ships. The ocean lit up like a Christmas tree. Planes landed on the first decks they saw. Some crashed, some rolled overboard, but most were saved. Enterprise recovered planes one after another, working like a conveyor belt. That night, Enterprise became the only point of light in the infinite dark. After the Philippine Sea, it was clear. The Japanese Navy was no longer capable of fighting a classic war. They had run out of hope. The enemy was backed into a corner, and they took the final, most terrifying step. If Japan no longer had aces, then living missiles would go into battle. The Japanese command created the Special Attack Corps. The world learned a new word that carried the chill of the grave: Kamikaze. And the primary target for these suicide pilots, their most coveted trophy, was, of course, her, the unsinkable Enterprise. 1945 brought a new form of horror to the Pacific. Previously, war was a duel of skills. Now, all of that lost its meaning. The Japanese changed the rules of the game. For American sailors, it turned into an endless psychological nightmare. You could shoot down a plane, but the burning machine would keep flying into your ship, by inertia, turning into a guided bomb. Enterprise became a magnet for these attacks. In March 1945, she was hit, but she survived, again. However, on May 14th, off the coast of Kyushu, fate decided to deal her perhaps the most accurate blow of the entire war. The sky was covered with low clouds, perfect weather for an ambush. Suddenly, a lone Zero fighter emerged from the overcast. At the controls sat Lieutenant Tomi Zai. He was a true ace. He aimed for the most vulnerable spot, the forward elevator. In the final seconds, he flipped his plane upside down so the bomb would enter the ship first. At 6:56 a.m., an explosion erupted that seemed to split the ocean. The strike hit exactly under the forward hoist. The detonation energy was monstrous. The 15-ton elevator platform was torn out by the roots and thrown into the air, to a height of 120 meters, higher than the Statue of Liberty. The massive steel square spun in the sky before crashing into the water. A hole gaped in the deck. Fire engulfed the hangar. Water poured in. Any other ship would have been doomed. Admiral Mitcher prepared to give the order to abandon ship. But the crew didn't run for the lifeboats. Men, dazed and concussed, threw themselves into the inferno. Damage control parties worked with such ferocity, it was as if the ship herself was transmitting her will to live to them. In 30 minutes, the fire was localized. In an hour, the ship was underway. One officer, watching this, remarked, "This ship is made of cursed steel. You just can't stop her." Deep inside the elevator shaft, sailors found the body of the Kamikaze pilot. On him were documents in the name of Tomi Zai. The Americans respectfully recovered the body of the enemy who had managed to deal them such a blow. The crew nicknamed that spot in the shaft the Tomb of Tomi. Even the adversary recognized the greatness of this ship, giving his life in an attempt to stop her. This was the final wound of the Enterprise. Soon, she headed home. When she entered New York Harbor, she was greeted as a national hero. The most decorated ship in the fleet, 20 battle stars, a symbol of a nation. It seemed she would now find peace as a museum ship. Who would raise a hand against a legend? But the war ended. The time for cold calculation arrived, and Enterprise's most terrifying enemy waited not in the ocean, but in the offices of Washington. October 17th, 1945, New York, Victory Parade. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal publicly declared, "The Enterprise is a shrine. She must be preserved forever." But words mean nothing when budget cuts begin. Soon, the ship was towed to a mothball fleet. Her boilers went cold. The great warrior turned into a line in an inventory ledger. She sat there for 10 years. Rust began to eat the hull that Japanese torpedoes couldn't pierce. The ship's veterans raised the alarm. Admiral Halsey himself led the fight. They asked to turn her into a museum. They needed to raise $2 million. Halsey wrote letters, spoke on the radio, school children sent pocket money. But the Navy officials were unmoved. Time ran out. Preservation of the ship was deemed impractical. In 1958, the sentence was signed. The Legend was sold at auction for $561,000. The price of 20 battle stars was equated to the value of scrap metal. The process was agonizing. As the tugs pulled her down the river, passing ships blew long, mournful whistles. It was a funeral march. Those very bulkheads that withstood kamikaze strikes were now melting under torches. The ship resisted until the last. The steel was high quality, tempered in battle. First they cut the mast, then the flight deck. Layer by layer, the Enterprise vanished. By 1960, nothing was left of the Gray Ghost. This is considered one of the most shameful episodes in the history of memory preservation. The only carrier to pass through the entire war was destroyed because of indifference. But it turned out, you can only destroy metal. You cannot cut the soul of a ship. The steel went to the furnace, but the story of the Enterprise did not end there. Because of this sacrifice, other legendary ships were saved and became museums. Enterprise left so her brothers could live. Even physically, she didn't vanish without a trace. In New Jersey, in a park, stands a monument. A massive steel plate from the ship's stern with the name Enterprise. The engineers simply couldn't bring themselves to cut it. The ship's bell was moved to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. That same bell that rang the alarm at Midway rings today. But the greatest legacy is the name. The U.S. Navy swore there would always be a ship with that name in the fleet. In 1961, the world's first nuclear carrier, the Enterprise, was launched. She served for half a century. And now, a new, third supercarrier, CVN-80 Enterprise, is being built. Steel from her nuclear predecessor was melted into her hull. The legend's DNA is passed forward. The name even went beyond the ocean. The creator of Star Trek named his ship exactly that, inspired by the legend of the Gray Ghost. The NASA space shuttle was also named in her honor. The Japanese were right. This truly is a ghost ship. You can blow her up, you can cut her hull into needles, but she will return anyway. Because Enterprise is not a set of rivets. It is a symbol that even when you are left completely alone and there is no hope, you do not give up. You turn your nose into the wind and you take the fight. Rest in peace, CV6. Your watch is over. But your story will live as long as the ocean exists.